Have you ever wondered? If one day I were thrown back into ancient Egypt, the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and the Nile River, could I survive? The answer might send a shiver down your spine. Not easily at all. Because behind the splendor of an immortal civilization, ancient Egypt was actually a land fraught with danger, where nature could suddenly unleash its destructive fury, and humans, despite their incredible organizational power, were merely small, fragile beings. Egypt lies along the Nile River, the longest river in the world, cutting through the arid Sahara Desert. Today, when we think of Egypt, we often envision the prosperity of dynasties, gold-laden tombs, and immortal structures. But for the people of that time, daily life was tied to a constant anxiety about nature. Floods, droughts, sandstorms, earthquakes, and even phenomena so bizarre they believed the gods themselves were enraged. The Nile River was the very heart of Egypt, providing fertile silt, drinking water, fish, and a vital transportation route. But this heart could also become a cruel monster. When the water rose too high, entire villages were submerged. When it fell too low, the fields dried up and famine ravaged the land. The Egyptians understood all too well that their existence depended on a fragile cycle, and any change in nature could become a collective death sentence. Beyond the Nile, the Sahara Desert surrounded Egypt like a colossal wall. Midday temperatures could soar above 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, and the desert winds, called the Khamsin, carried scorching hot sand, enough to suffocate, blind, and bury anything in their path. Countless caravans and soldiers crossing the desert fell, their desiccated bodies becoming anonymous phantoms in the golden sand. However, that is only the surface. History and archaeology have shown us that ancient Egypt faced far more extreme and strange natural disasters. Volcanic ash from the Mediterranean could alter the Nile's course and wipe out crops. Violent storms were inscribed on stone stelas like the Tempest Stele, recounting scenes of hail and whirlwinds devastating entire cities. Unexpected earthquakes collapsed structures weighing thousands of tons. And sometimes, the sky seemed to turn into hell, glowing red with dust or pitch black for days on end like the apocalypse. The most terrifying part was this: in that context, people had no technology to fight back. There were no hydroelectric dams, no seismographs, no warning satellites. Whenever a natural disaster struck, all they could do was pray, offering gifts, making sacrifices, or building temples in hopes of appeasing the gods. And imagine, if you were a commoner living in that era, could you survive the sudden floods, the skin-searing sandstorms, or the earthquakes that could bury an entire village in an instant? This is the beginning of our journey today, to explore the most horrific natural disasters that ever struck ancient Egypt. Disasters that not only claimed thousands of lives but also shook the Pharaoh's throne and changed the course of human history. So, what was the greatest obsession of ancient Egypt? First, we must talk about the Nile River, both a blessing and a demon. If ancient Egypt was called the gift of the Nile, then this very river was also the sower of the most terrible nightmares. Without the Nile, there would be no Egyptian civilization. But if the Nile turned volatile, people had almost no chance of survival when the river became a monster. Every year in the summer, the Nile's waters rose due to rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands. For the Egyptians, this was a crucial time. The water overflowed its banks, depositing a layer of fertile silt on the fields. They awaited the flood season like a miracle, as it determined the survival of their crops. However, the Nile was not always merciful. In some years, the water rose too high, sweeping away houses, livestock, and even sturdy stone temples. Ancient records show that there were floods so massive that entire regions of villages were wiped out, leaving only mud and corpses drifting along the banks. The Egyptians believed this was a sign that the god Hapi, the deity of the Nile, was angry and punishing them. Imagine, you are an Egyptian farmer, your house built near the riverbank. Night falls, the water roars, and a cold wind whistles through the cracks in your door. When you open your eyes, your entire family is swept away in the dark, churning water with no bridges or rescue boats. To them, a great flood was nothing short of a miniature apocalypse. When the Nile fell silent, the nightmare of drought, if a high flood sowed death, a low flood was even more terrifying. When the Nile's waters did not rise enough, the land cracked and crops withered. Instead of a bountiful harvest, the people faced prolonged famine. History has recorded horrific periods around 2200 BCE. During what is known as the 4.2K event, the Nile's water level remained low for many consecutive years. The result was a great famine that triggered social upheaval. Ancient texts describe horrifying scenes. People resorting to cannibalism to survive, corpses littering the streets, and the complete collapse of Egypt's old kingdom. Picture this. You go to your fields, and the ground is cracked open under the sun, seeds fail to sprout, livestock die of thirst, and children cry incessantly. With no food left, you are forced to eat wild grass, dig for roots, and even consume leather or decaying animal carcasses. And when those are gone, death becomes the only option. Laments carved into history. One of the most famous texts, the Epur Papyrus, recorded that period with words full of despair. The river flows, yet people thirst. The hungry belly churns. People eat other people. The river water has turned red like blood. These are not just literary records, but the agonized cries of a people pushed to the brink by nature. The fragile line between life and death. The frightening thing was, the Egyptians had absolutely no way to predict the Nile's water level. Without modern dams or weather forecasting, everything depended on chance. To measure the water, they only had millimeters, structures with markings carved into stone. But when the water was too low or too high, they were all meaningless. A year of favorable flooding gives the entire country was filled with wheat, beer, bread, and fresh fish. A year of abnormal flooding gives the entire nation was plunged into death, chaos, and even dynastic change. And just think, if you live there, with no supermarkets, no strategic reserves, no international aid, could you withstand a single year of crop failure? Or would you be forced to do whatever it takes to survive, including the most barbaric acts? But the Nile was just the beginning. Other terrifying disasters from the sky also sowed nightmares across ancient Egypt. If the floods and droughts from the Nile made the Egyptians tremble with hunger, the disasters that came from the sky instilled in them a different kind of horror, the terror of celestial fire and a darkness that enveloped the entire land. When distant ash engulfed Egypt. Few people know that Egypt has no active volcanoes within its territory. But that did not protect them from horrific eruptions in the Mediterranean and Africa. When a massive volcano erupted, ash could travel thousands of kilometers, and Egypt, though far away, still suffered the consequences. One of the most notorious examples is the eruption of the Thera Santorini volcano around 1600 BCE, considered one of the greatest natural disasters in human history. Ash from that eruption spread across the eastern Mediterranean, blanketing the Egyptian sky. Ancient inscriptions indicate a long period when the sun did not shine normally, and the sky was as gloomy as if it had been stained black. Try to imagine. You wake up one morning, but the sky is as dark as midnight. A dim light filters through a thick layer of dust, no longer the brilliant gold of the desert, but a haunting crimson red. You don't know if it's day or night or what season it is. Plants cannot photosynthesize, crops fail, and livestock slowly die. In the eyes of the Egyptians, this was the wrath of Ra, the sun god, when natural disaster became legend. This event of a darkened sky was so deeply etched in the Egyptian psyche that it entered mythology and the Bible. Some scholars suggest that the plagues of Egypt in the book of Exodus, such as 3 days of darkness, the Nile turning to blood, and hail mixed with fire, could actually be descriptions of natural phenomena linked to volcanic eruptions. The Egyptians saw red ash falling, the river changing color, and rain mixed with ash and stone. To them, these were not natural phenomena, but the dark magic of angry gods. Ash, the silent killer. What was more horrific was that the ash did not kill instantly, but tortured slowly. The Egyptians inhaled fine particles, leading to difficulty breathing, pneumonia, and suffocation. Drinking water became contaminated, and the land lost its fertility. They witnessed entire herds of livestock drop dead, and young children cough until they stopped breathing. As food supplies dwindled, people were forced to abandon their homes, leading to migrations, raids, and riots. The Pharaohs' dynasty was shaken multiple times because it could not provide relief for the poor. And all of this was because of a volcano that erupted hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Fire from the sky, the Egyptian obsession. The rains of fire mentioned in historical records could also have originated from volcanic ash. When the ash mixed with rain, it fell like hot embers, causing fires, burning down wooden houses, and searing flesh. For an ancient Egyptian farmer, watching their entire village consumed by a rain of fire must have been an experience that convinced them the end of the world had come, life hanging by a thread. The most terrifying thing here was not just death, but the absolute loss of control. With floods and droughts, at least the people knew to look to the Nile and could implore the god Hapi. But with ash from the sky, they were completely helpless. They could not predict it, could not fight it, and could not flee from it. Put yourself in that situation, standing in the middle of a square in Thebes, looking up at a crimson sky thick with ash, hearing the lost cries of children and the wails of the elderly, feeling as if the world is being destroyed second by second. Would you have the courage to survive those dark days? But all of this was just what came from the heavens. Ancient Egypt also faced the fury of the desert, sandstorms, poisonous winds, and tempests that buried everything in an endless sea of sand. If the Nile was Egypt's lifeline, the desert surrounding it was the colossal wall of death. Behind the endless golden beauty of the sand lay one of its most brutal enemies, the sandstorms and poisonous winds of the desert. They not only sowed fear but could annihilate an entire caravan or a whole village in just a few hours. When the desert rages, the winds from the west were often called Kamsin by the Egyptians, meaning 50 days, referring to a long haunting period when the desert became fierce. This was not just an ordinary wind, but a scorching stream of air carrying billions of tiny sand particles that whipped straight into the human body. Imagine, you are walking on a path through the desert when suddenly the sky darkens, and the sun disappears behind a curtain of red dust. The wind howls and sand slaps against your face like thousands of tiny knives. You can't open your eyes, your nose and throat are filled with dust, and your breathing becomes rapid. Your body feels scorching hot as sweat evaporates instantly. And just a few minutes later, the entire world around you turns into a vast sea of sand with no direction, no escape. Physical and mental torture. A sandstorm not only temporarily blinds you, but also robs you of your sense of direction. The ancient Egyptians had no compasses, accurate maps, or positioning technology. When a storm rose, caravans, armies, or farmers crossing the desert would become completely disoriented. Many walked in circles until they collapsed from exhaustion and died of dehydration right in the middle of the desert. In ancient texts, the Egyptians often described the desert as the domain of the evil god Seth, the god of chaos, storms, and death. Whenever the Kamsin swept in, they believed it was Seth on the rampage, spreading madness to both humans and animals. The poison wind, an invisible killer. Even more terrifying than the sand was the hot wind. The Khamsin could raise the temperature to 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, in just a few minutes. The searing dry heat felt like it was burning the lungs, causing rapid dehydration. Just a few hours of being lost, and the body would fall into a state of acute dehydration, with cracked lips, blurring vision, before finally collapsing onto the sand. There are records showing that entire herds of camels, horses, and Egyptian soldiers were buried after a single storm. Their bodies, mixed with the sand, are still being found under geological layers hundreds of years later. When nature becomes a curse, in ancient inscriptions, the Egyptians described scenes of people collapsing in the sand, their eyes no longer seeing the sun. Survivors recounted that the howling wind sounded like the wails of souls, and the sand pouring down on them felt like a rain of death. Many scholars believe that the legends of powerful armies vanishing in the desert are not mere fiction but could well have originated from these ruthless sandstorms. Could you survive? Try to put yourself in the position of an ancient Egyptian farmer or merchant. You have no protective mask, no water reserves, no GPS or means of communication. Only your legs, your eyes, and a few thin pieces of cloth. When the storm hits, you would be swallowed by the crimson darkness, turned into a dry skeleton buried deep beneath the sand, only to be found thousands of years later, perhaps in a kneeling position, hands still covering your face. But sandstorms were only part of the nightmare. The Egyptians also had to face deadly epidemics, an invisible enemy that spread terror in crowded cities, where not even the pharaoh could escape. If sandstorms, volcanoes, or floods could be seen and potentially avoided, epidemics were the invisible killers. They crept through every street, every temple, and every house in ancient Egypt. Once an epidemic spread, no one, not even the pharaoh, could be certain of survival. Invisible enemies in the shadows. With its seasonally hot and humid climate and dense population concentrated along the Nile, ancient Egypt was an ideal breeding ground for disease. Closely packed houses, crowded markets, and often contaminated water sources all combined to create the perfect environment for bacteria and parasites to thrive. One of the most terrible diseases was the plague, believed to have reached Egypt from the Near East. When an outbreak occurred, entire cities were plunged into a state of dread. People developed high fevers, swollen lymph nodes, and oozing sores, then dropped dead after just a few days. Bodies piled up, and no one dared to bury them for fear of infection. Not only that, but Egypt also faced tuberculosis, parasitic worm infections, malaria, and an ancient form of syphilis. Mummies that have been excavated show that many pharaohs and nobles died from these seemingly ordinary diseases, which were extremely deadly in an era without medicine. Death on every street. Try to imagine you are living in Thebes in a narrow alley. One day, your neighbor develops a high fever and coughs up blood. The next day, their entire family lies motionless on the dirt floor. Panicked residents lock their doors and hide inside, but the disease still knocks on every door. The stench of death filled the city. The sounds of wailing echoed everywhere. Groups of people struggled to carry bodies out to the desert for cremation or hasty burial in mass graves. In that place, there was no distinction between pharaoh, noble, or farmer. All became victims alike. The curse of the gods. The ancient Egyptians did not understand bacteria or viruses. They believed that epidemics were curses from the gods. If the pharaoh did something to displease the god Re or the god Osiris, the entire nation would have to pay the price in blood. Therefore, whenever an epidemic broke out, the temples echoed with pleas and sacrifices. There are even records suggesting that some communities offered human lives to appease the wrath of the deities. When disease changed history, many researchers believe that disease contributed to the weakening of ancient Egypt during pivotal periods. When the Hyksos or the Persians attacked, part of the reason Egypt fell so quickly was that its population had already been ravaged by epidemics. A prosperous society could collapse after just a few seasons of plague. The magnificent pyramids and majestic temples could not shield people from the cruelty of invisible diseases. Could you have survived? If you lived in ancient Egypt, you had no vaccines, no antibiotics, no modern hospitals. A small scratch could lead to a fatal infection. An unusual fever could be a sign of the plague. And when an epidemic arrived, no one knew if they would still be breathing the next day. But there was still another fearsome threat from the earth itself. Rare but terrifying earthquakes once made the Egyptians believe the world was about to collapse. Egypt is famous for its vast desert and the endless Nile River, but few know that this land also suffered from horrific earthquakes. And because the Egyptians believed that the earth was the eternal foundation of the universe, every time the ground shook, the entire society was plunged into apocalyptic fear. Earthquakes, a rare but haunting menace. Compared to Greece or Mesopotamia, Egypt was not a region prone to frequent earthquakes. However, when they did occur, the consequences were particularly severe. This was because colossal structures like pyramids, temples, and statues, which were built to last forever, would suddenly shake and crack. Imagine, you are standing in the shadow of a statue of the god Horus when suddenly the ground beneath your feet trembles and giant stone blocks come crashing down. The screams of people mingle with the sound of breaking columns and collapsing walls. In that moment, all belief in Egypt's immortality seemed to vanish. Temples collapsing in an instant. Some Greco-Roman records recount that the Serapeum Temple in Alexandria was once severely damaged by an earthquake. The port city of Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt during the Hellenistic period, was also devastated by earthquakes multiple times, to the extent that the lighthouse of Alexandria, a wonder of the ancient world, was ultimately destroyed by both earthquakes and tsunamis. For the Egyptians, these events were not just physical disasters, but also signs of divine anger. When a temple collapsed, they believed the god had abandoned his home, leaving humanity to face punishment. Earthquakes and tsunamis, the double blow. Not only did they cause tremors on land, but earthquakes also generated tsunamis that crashed into the Mediterranean coast. Alexandria and other coastal cities were repeatedly inundated by seawater, which swept away houses, ships, and people. Ancient carvings depict scenes of deep flooding, with people climbing onto rooftops to escape, but most were swept away by the waves forever. Sudden death and spiritual trauma. Unlike floods or epidemics, earthquakes arrived without warning. There were no signs. No one knew when the earth would crack open. For the ancient Egyptians, who believed that the cosmic order was maintained by the goddess Mat, the shaking of the ground was proof that the entire universe was out of balance. Put yourself in the position of an ancient inhabitant of Thebes. One peaceful night, you are sleeping in your mud brick house. Suddenly, everything shakes, the roof collapses, dust fills the air, and screams echo through the neighborhood. When you crawl outside, the entire street is in ruins, and the sky is glowing red from the flames rising from collapsed temples. You would believe you had just lived through the actual apocalypse. Disaster and legacy. Although infrequent, earthquakes were powerful enough to be deeply etched into the memory of the Egyptians. They left their marks on the great monuments, cracks on statues, displaced blocks on pyramids. And today, as archaeologists trace these clues, they see clearly. Even the most powerful civilization was helpless against the forces of nature. Conclusion: would you have survived? If you lived in ancient Egypt, could you have overcome all of these disasters? Floods and droughts, leaving you in constant hunger and thirst. Volcanic ash, suffocating you under a black sky. Sandstorms and poison winds, burying you beneath a sea of sand. Invisible epidemics, taking your life in just a few days. Earthquakes and tsunamis turning magnificent structures into rubble. Ancient Egypt is praised as a land of life, but it was also a place where people had to constantly face deadly challenges. And perhaps that is why they always believed in gods, and rituals, and mystical beliefs, because only those could help them stand firm against the nightmares of nature. But the question remains open. Could it be that these very natural disasters changed the course of history, contributing to the fall of the mighty ancient Egypt? But is that really the whole story?